September 17, 1944. The village of Oosterbeek, Holland. 10 a.m. For the first time in weeks, SS Sturmbannführer Sepp Kraft allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. His understrength SS Panzergrenadier Training and Reserve Battalion had finally stopped moving. After being shuttled back and forth across Holland like chess pieces on a board that kept changing, his men were settled. The main body was billeted in Oosterbeek, with the rest in nearby Arnhem. Another 1,000 SS recruits were expected any day for training. The 37-year-old officer stood in the doorway of his temporary headquarters, a requisitioned Dutch farmhouse, watching his men go about their morning routines. Some cleaned weapons, others wrote letters home, a few played cards, their laughter carrying across the yard. It was quiet, almost peaceful. Kraft had fought the ambitious Wehrmacht major's order to relocate, fought hard. But when he learned that Field Marshal Walter Model himself was moving his headquarters into Oosterbeek, Kraft had backed down quickly. You didn't argue with Model. So Head moved his battalion northwest into the woods and farms near Wolfheze. Not far, just far enough to stay out of the Field Marshal's way. It was the smart play, the safe play. Sepp Kraft had no desire to draw Model's attention. 3 miles away in the elegant Tafelberg Hotel that now served as Army Group B headquarters, Field Marshal Model was finishing his morning briefing. The 53-year-old commander stood before a large map of Holland, his monocled Chief of Staff General Hans Krebs at his side. Operations Officer Colonel Tempelhof pointed to British positions along the Meuse-Escaut Canal. All intelligence indicates a renewed offensive here, Herr Feldmarschall Tempelhof said. The British Second Army has been reinforcing this sector for days. Model nodded curtly. His eyes traced the canal line, calculating distances, assessing threats. The British were coming. Of that he was certain. Montgomery was methodical, predictable. He would push north, through the established bridgehead, grinding forward with his typical caution. Anti-aircraft positions? Model asked. Reinforced, sir. Particularly around the bridges. Good. When they come, we'll make them pay for every kilometer. Model checked his watch. Nearly lunchtime. The hotel's dining room had been converted into an officer's mess, and Model prided himself on maintaining proper standards even in war. Order, discipline, routine. These were the foundations of military excellence. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher over Holland. It was going to be a beautiful day. 21 miles northwest near the town of Vought, Colonel General Kurt Student sat at a desk drowning in paperwork. The 64-year-old father of German airborne forces, the man who had pioneered paratrooper operations, who had led the audacious assault on Eben Emael, who had commanded the costly but successful invasion of Crete, was now buried under administrative reports. Red tape, he muttered to his operations officer, Major Reinhard. Even in the battlefield, the paperwork follows me. Student rubbed his eyes and stood walking to the window of his cottage headquarters. The September morning was gorgeous. Clear skies, light winds, perfect flying weather. In the distance he could hear the rumble of aircraft engines. Nothing unusual. Allied bombers flew over Holland every day, heading east to pound targets in Germany. Sometimes they came back in the afternoon, riddled with flak holes but still flying. Student had grown accustomed to Allied air superiority. It was a fact of life now, like rain or cold. You couldn't change it. You could only endure it, and try not to think about what you might have accomplished with such resources. He walked out onto the small balcony, tilting his face up toward the sun. The drone of aircraft was louder now. Students squinted into the bright sky, watching as bomber formations passed overhead. Night orderly, heading east as always. Beautiful machines. Beautifully organized. Student allowed himself a moment of professional jealousy before returning to his desk. The war wouldn't be won by admiring the enemy's aircraft. He had ground defenses to organize bridge security, to coordinate 1,000 administrative details to manage. The paperwork was waiting. Across occupied Holland, German forces settled into another Sunday. Veterans who had survived Normandy, who had been pushed back across France in the chaotic late summer retreat, who had finally stabilized defensive lines in Holland. These men were exhausted. They had been bombed, shelled, strafed, and overrun so many times that the constant presence of Allied aircraft had become background noise. White noise. Something you learned to ignore. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Harzer, commanding the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen, was at his headquarters in Beekbergen, preparing for a ceremony. Today he would award the Knight's Cross to Captain Paul Grabner, commander of the division's 600-man reconnaissance battalion. There would be champagne afterward. A proper celebration. Harzer glanced out the window as another formation of bombers droned overhead. He paid them no attention. His men were numb to the constant air traffic. After months of Allied air superiority, the sight of enemy planes was as routine as sunrise. At 2 SS Panzer Corps headquarters in Doetinchem, Lieutenant General Wilhelm Bittrich was equally unconcerned. The bombers were routine fare, nothing more. His 2 panzer divisions, the 9th and 10th SS, were scattered across the Arnhem area in bivouac positions, refitting and rebuilding after the brutal fighting in France. They needed rest. They needed equipment. They needed time. Time they thought they had. None of these professional soldiers, not Model, not Student, not Bittrich, not Harzer, understood what was actually unfolding above them. They saw bombers and assumed business as usual. They heard engines and thought nothing of it. They were about to learn a terrible lesson about assumptions. While German commanders in Holland enjoyed their quiet Sunday morning airfields across southern England erupted into controlled chaos. At 24 bases stretching from Gloucestershire and Oxfordshire in the west to Lincolnshire in the east, the greatest aerial armada ever assembled for a single operation was preparing to take flight. Thousands of men moved with urgent purpose through the pre-dawn darkness. Ground crews swarmed over aircraft making final checks. Fuel trucks topped off tanks. Ammunition handlers loaded supplies. Glider pilots walked around their fragile wooden craft testing control surfaces, checking tow ropes, running through mental checklists. And the gliders themselves, hundreds upon hundreds of them, sat on airfields like a fleet of enormous silent birds. They came in 3 main types, each designed for specific purposes. The smallest were the American Wacos, officially designated CG-4A. These plywood and canvas machines could carry 13 troops or a jeep with crew. Compact, maneuverable, and cheap to produce, the Wacos were the workhorses of American airborne operations. But they were also frighteningly fragile. Pilots joked darkly about the Waco's unofficial nickname, the Flying Coffin. Next came the British Horses, larger, sturdier, capable of carrying 28 troops or a small vehicle. These gliders had a unique feature: the entire tail section could be quickly removed after landing, allowing jeeps and light artillery to be driven straight out the back. It was an elegant solution to the cargo problem. It also made the Horses slightly less terrifying to fly than the Wacos. Slightly. But the monsters, the true leviathans of the glider fleet, were the Hamilcars. These enormous British-designed craft could carry 8 tons. A small tank, 2 3-ton trucks, artillery pieces with full ammunition loads. Landing a Hamilcar was like trying to control a falling barn. They were huge, ungainly, and absolutely essential for bringing heavy equipment into combat. All told, more than 500 gliders were being prepared for Operation Market Garden. They would carry troops, jeeps, artillery, ammunition, medical supplies, radios, motorcycles, and even bridging equipment. Everything an airborne army would need to seize and hold objectives deep behind enemy lines. Sergeant Roy Hatch, a Horsa co-pilot, walked around his glider for the 3rd time, checking every visible connection point, every control cable, every hinge. His aircraft would carry a jeep, 2 trailers filled with mortar ammunition, and 3 soldiers. Simple cargo. Simple mission. Nothing about this felt simple. "Nervous?" asked the pilot, a veteran named Waldrip. "I've done this before," Hatch said. "Not like this you haven't. None of us have." Hatch couldn't argue. Had flown combat missions in North Africa and Sicily. Had landed gliders under fire before. But those had been night operations. Smaller scale, more chaotic, easier to hide in the darkness. This was something entirely different. This was broad daylight. This was the largest airborne operation in history. This was flying a wooden aircraft with no engine, no armor, and no second chances straight into occupied Holland, in full view of every German gun within 50 miles. "We'll be fine," Hatch said, trying to convince himself as much as Waldrip. "We've got fighter escort. We've got the element of surprise. We'll be down and unloaded before Jerry knows what hit him." Waldrip gave him a look that said he wasn't buying it. But he didn't argue. Nearby, Lieutenant Pat Glover of the British 1st Airborne Division's 4th Parachute Brigade was having a completely different conversation. "You're not seriously bringing that chicken," said another lieutenant, staring in disbelief. "Glure, not seriously bringing that chicken," said another lieutenant, staring in disbelief. Glure carefully secured the small canvas bag to his parachute harness. "Myrtle has made 6 training jumps. This will be her 7th. Myrtle, the parachute, Glure. Myrtle, Metcher. Lure. Myrtle. Lure mad sicken south set of parachute wings fastened to an elastic band. Myrtle's collar." The other lieutenant shook his head. "You're mad." "Probably Glure. Glure, and Crier. Lure, Klure. Lure, Lure. Matcher. Lure. Matcher. Malklure. Nair. Matcher. Matcher. Malklure. Matcher. Moklure. Matcher. Matcher. Moklure. 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 Lure. Moklure. Moklure. Voice that many of them wouldn't be coming back from Holland. Across the airfield, similar scenes played out thousands of times. Young men joking to hide their fear. Veterans offering quiet advice to replacements. Officers reviewing maps and objectives one final time. Chaplains offering blessings to anyone who wanted them. Lance Corporal Sidney Nunn of the 1st Air Landing Brigade was simply relieved to be leaving. His camp near Kieval had become a nightmare thanks to a persistent mole that kept burrowing into his mattress. Nunn didn't care where they were going. Anywhere was better than another night with that damned mole. Private Leo Hart, 21 years old, and trying hard not to show his nerves, had heard rumors that 4,000 SS troops were waiting in the drop zones. He didn't believe they were actually going. The operation would be cancelled. It had to be. Nobody would be crazy enough to drop paratroopers in daylight into an area crawling with SS. He was wrong. At briefing rooms across the bases, officers pulled back curtains to reveal maps of Holland. Red lines traced the route across the English Channel, over the North Sea into occupied territory. Landing zones were marked with circles, objectives labeled with precise military nomenclature. 5 bridges. That was the mission. 5 bridges spanning rivers and canals across 64 miles of Holland. The bridges had to be taken intact, seized before the Germans could demolish them. If the bridges fell, so would the operation. The American 101st Airborne Division would take the southernmost bridges near Eindhoven and Son. General Gavin's 82nd Airborne would seize the crucial spans at Grave and Nijmegen. and the British 1st Airborne Division landing the farthest north would capture the prize, the bridge over the Lower Rhine at Arnhem, 64 miles behind German lines. "Gentlemen," one briefing officer told his assembled glider pilots, "you are participating in the most ambitious airborne operation ever conceived. Some have called it daring, some have called it brilliant, some have called it insane." Nervous laughter rippled through the room. Intelligence indicates moderate German resistance in the landing zones. Local security forces, perhaps some anti-aircraft. Nothing our fighters can't suppress. You'll have complete air superiority. The Germans won't know what hit them. More laughter, less nervous this time. What the briefing officer didn't say, what intelligence had failed to adequately identify, was that 2 veteran SS Panzer divisions were refitting in the Arnhem area. Battle-hardened units from Normandy, under strength but still dangerous. Professional soldiers who knew how to fight. The intelligence failure would cost thousands of lives. But for now, on this bright Sunday morning, optimism reigned. The plan was bold. The execution would be flawless. Montgomery himself had declared that Market Garden could end the war by Christmas. At 9:45 a.m., the first gliders began rolling down runways. History was about to be made. The sound was like nothing England had ever heard before. From 24 airfields across the southern part of the country, new 700 aircraft rose into the September sky. C-47 Skytrains, Halifax and Stirling bombers, converted to tow duties, Albemarles, all straining against the weight of their glider charges. The combined roar of thousands of engines created a physical force, a wall of sound that rattled windows, shook buildings, and made conversation impossible. At the bases in Gloucestershire and Oxfordshire, the British glider forces were first to launch. The logistics were staggering. 320 Horsa and Waco gliders had to be airborne within 2 hours, each tethered to its tug aircraft by a 300-foot nylon rope. The launch rate had never been attempted before. 1 glider and tug combination every minute. Staff Sergeant Joseph Kitchener sat in his glider cockpit watching the combination ahead of him begin its takeoff roll. The C-47 tug accelerated down the runway, engines screaming. The tow rope stretched tight. The glider, a 15,000-pound Horsa loaded with artillery pieces, began to move slowly at first, then faster. The glider lifted off first, the tug still rolling on the ground. For a few seconds the glider flew just above the runway, the tow rope angled down to the still earthbound C-47. Then the transport's wheels left the ground and both aircraft began climbing the rope, bouncing and snaking between them. "That's us," Kitchener's co-pilot said. "Tower's given us green." Kitchener released the brakes. Their tug, a Halifax bomber, began rolling forward. The rope tightened. The glider lurched into motion. They accelerated down the runway, 30 miles per hour, 40-50. Kitchener eased back on the control yoke. The horse's nose lifted. The wheels left the ground. They were flying. The sensation was bizarre. Being pulled through the air by an invisible hand, the tow rope creating just enough drag to make the glider feel sluggish and unresponsive. Every movement of the tug aircraft transmitted down the rope as a series of jerks and tugs. When the Halifax banked, the glider swung wide on the outside of the turn like a child on a rope swing. "Formation ahead," the co-pilot called out. Kitchener looked up and felt his breath catch. The sky was full of aircraft. Dozens of glider-tug combinations were already airborne, climbing slowly toward their assigned altitude. More were taking off every minute. The formations assembled with surprising precision. Pairs of gliders echeloning to the right, climbing in wide circles over the Bristol Channel, then turning back over their departure airfields before heading toward the marshalling point at Hatfield, north of London. Kitchener had flown combat missions before. Had seen large formations. But nothing compared to this. "My God," his co-pilot whispered. "Look at them all." The armada stretched as far as they could see. Ahead, behind, above, below. Everywhere Kitchener-looked aircraft filled the sky. Gliders bounced and swayed behind their tugs like enormous kites. Fighter escorts wheeled overhead in protective patterns. The September sun glinted off hundreds of plexiglass cockpit canopies. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. On the ground below, England stopped to stare. In villages across Oxfordshire, people emerged from their homes, hands shading their eyes, gazing upward in wonder. In Gloucestershire, farmers abandoned their Sunday chores to watch the sky trains pass overhead. Horses panicked in fields, bolting from the deafening noise. Cattle stampeded. Dogs howled. In some towns, road traffic came to a complete halt. Drivers simply stopped their vehicles in the middle of streets and got out to watch. Passengers on trains pressed against windows, craning for a better view. In London, the spectacle was overwhelming. It was Battle of Britain Commemoration Day, the 4th anniversary of the RAF's desperate fight against the Luftwaffe. Special church services were being held across the city to honor the valiant few who had saved Britain from invasion in 1940. At Westminster Cathedral, the congregation was singing the Magnificat when the first formations passed overhead. The mighty organ, one of the finest in Europe, was completely drowned out by the roar of engines. The singers' mouths moved, but no sound reached beyond the first rows of pews. One by one, then in groups, worshippers abandoned their services and hurried outside. The streets of London filled with people, all staring skyward. Formation after formation thundered overhead at what seemed impossibly low altitude. 500 feet low enough to make out individual aircraft, to see the glider pilots in their cockpits, to wave at the fighters' escorts screaming past. In North London, a Salvation Army band had been playing in a small park honoring the RAF pilots of 1940. As the noise grew unbearable, the musicians stopped playing one by one. Trumpets falling silent, drums going quiet. Only the bass drummer continued, his eyes fixed on the sky, thumping out a simple rhythm on his drum: 3 beats, and a pause, 3 beats, and a pause. Boom, boom, boom. Pause. Boom, boom, boom. Pause. Morse code. V for victory. Angela Hawkins, a Red Cross worker, was on a train heading north from London when the formations passed overhead. She rushed to the window, pressing her face against the glass. The sky was black with aircraft, wave after wave, seemingly endless. Like droves of starlings, she whispered. The woman next to her was crying. "It's the end," she said. "Don't you see? This is the end of the war. It has to be. Nothing can stand against this." Hawkins wanted to believe it. Watching the mighty armada pass overhead, seeing the gliders bobbing behind their tugs, the fighters wheeling in protective formations, it seemed impossible that Germany could survive such an onslaught. This wasn't just an air raid. This was an invasion from the sky. The British people knew they were witnessing history. They just didn't know, couldn't know, how much blood that history would cost. Captain Arie Besterbroeche, a Dutch officer attached to the 82nd Airborne Division, sat in a C-47 transport aircraft over the English Channel and tried to process what he was seeing. "This is unbelievable," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Every plane the Allies must have possessed must be engaged in this single operation." He wasn't far wrong. Of the 4,700 aircraft airborne for Market Garden, more than 2,000 were troop carriers and glider tugs. Another 1,500 were fighters and fighter bombers flying protective escort. The remainder were bombers that had struck German anti-aircraft positions in the pre-dawn hours. It was quite simply the largest airborne operation in military history, and everyone involved knew it. Staff Sergeant William Thompson at the controls of a C-47, towing a 4-ton Horsa, found the navigation surprisingly easy. Across the English Channel, strings of Royal Navy launches had been positioned at regular intervals, 17 along the northern route, 10 along the southern path. From altitude they looked like stepping stones across the water. There wasn't much navigating to do, Thompson would recall later. The launches below us were set out like stepping stones across the channel. But those launches served another crucial purpose: air-sea rescue. In the 30-minute crossing to Holland, 8 gliders cut loose from their tugs and ditched in the cold North Sea. Mechanical failures, broken tow ropes, pilot error. The causes varied. The result was the same: a wooden glider hitting water at 100 miles per hour. Lieutenant Neville Hay, flying in a transport aircraft with his Phantom communications unit, watched with what he later described as complete detachment as 2 gliders ditched ahead of him. A third cut loose. As he watched the tow rope falling away, the glider settling into a steep glide toward the gray water below. "Have a look down there," Hobkirk Hay shouted to his corporal, pointing. Corporal Hobkirk glanced down, and his face went pale. "Nothing to worry about," Hay said quickly, realizing his mistake. "Look, the boats are already picking them up." And they were. The air-sea rescue launches were incredibly efficient. Amphibious aircraft circled ditched gliders, marking their positions until the fast motor launches could reach them. Men in the water were pulled aboard within minutes. Staff Sergeant Cyril Line wasn't watching the other gliders. He was too busy trying to save his own. Line was copiloting a Horsa in a long train of swaying black gliders when he noticed the combination ahead of him begin to descend. Slowly at first, then faster. The glider cut loose from its tug and continued down toward the channel. Line watched mesmerized as a white ring of foam appeared where the glider hit the water. "Poor devils," he muttered. At that moment the starboard propellers on his tug aircraft slowed, then stopped. "Oh, bloody hell," Line said. The C-47's speed dropped immediately. Line found himself in the embarrassing position of overtaking his own tug, the glider catching up to the now slower transport like a boat overtaking another in a current. His pilot made the only decision possible. Cutting loose. The tow rope released. The Horsa was suddenly free-flying, gliding over the channel with no power and diminishing altitude. "Stand by for ditching," the pilot called back to the passengers. Behind them in the cargo compartment, soldiers began attacking the glider's plywood sides with rifle butts, trying to create escape routes. The sound of splintering wood filled the aircraft. "Stop that," Line screamed. "Strap yourselves in." The channel rushed up to meet them. The pilot pulled back on the yoke, flaring the glider for impact. The Horsa hit the water with a tremendous thud, the sound of wood striking concrete. Line went under. Water cold and dark. Disorientation. Which way was up? Then his head broke the surface. Men were splashing around him. The glider was already sinking, the cabin section completely torn away. But everyone was alive. Everyone was accounted for. A launch was already speeding toward them, a white wake spreading behind its bow. They were rescued within minutes. Captain Neil Sweeney of the 101st Airborne Division wasn't worried about ditching. His C-47 was running smoothly, his parachute was properly packed, and his men were in good spirits. From his position near the open door, Sweeney had a perfect view of the endless formations. "There are so many planes," he said, shaking his head in wonder. "It looks like we could get out on the wings and walk all the way to Holland." The men around him laughed, but nervously. The joke hit too close to the truth. If even a small percentage of these aircraft were shot down, the losses would be catastrophic. In a Waco glider somewhere over the channel, Sergeant Roy Hatch was discovering the true meaning of vulnerability. The Waco bounced and swayed behind its tug like a child's toy on a string. Every air current, every shift in the tow plane's speed or altitude translated into violent motion in the glider. The wooden frame creaked and groaned. The canvas skin rippled in the slipstream. Hatch had flown in gliders before, but always at night. Darkness had hidden the full horror of the experience. Now in broad daylight, he could see everything. The tow rope ahead of them was just a thin nylon line, 350 pounds braking strength, which sounded impressive until you remembered it was holding a multi-ton aircraft in flight. The rope stretched and contracted rhythmically like a living thing. When the tug climbed, the rope angled upward. When it descended, the rope went slack and then snapped tight again with a jerk that sent shudders through the entire glider. Behind him, the jeep and trailers were secured with chains. Hatch couldn't help imagining what would happen if those chains broke during a hard landing. Several tons of metal and ammunition would come forward like a battering ram, crushing everything in their path. "You're thinking about it," Waldrop said. "Thinking about what?" "The cargo." "You're imagining the chains breaking." Hatch didn't answer. "Don't," Waldrop said. "Think about something else. Think about German anti-aircraft gunners. Think about flak. Think about fighter attacks. That's supposed to help? No. But at least you'll be worried about something you can't control instead of something you can't control." Hatch stared at him. "That makes no sense. Welcome to glider duty." Ahead of them, the Dutch coast appeared on the horizon, a thin dark line separating gray water from gray sky. They were almost there. At the Tafelberg Hotel in Oosterbeek, Field Marshal Model's lunch was interrupted by a breathless lieutenant colonel from the operations office. Model looked up from his plate, irritated. He had been enjoying a rare moment of peace. A properly prepared meal, civilized conversation with his staff, a brief respite from the endless pressures of command. "This had better be important," Model said coldly. "Herr Feldmarschall," the colonel said, fighting to catch his breath. "Unteroffizier. Uppinger reports gliders landing at Wolfheze." Model's chief of staff, General Hans Krebs, had been lifting a forkful of food to his mouth. His hand froze midway. The monocle fell from his eye, clattering onto his plate. "Gliders," Model said. "Yes, sir. Multiple gliders. He says they're landing." The colonel consulted a hastily scribbled note. "In our laps." For a moment no one moved. Then Model stood so abruptly his chair scraped backward across the floor. "Get me student. Get me Bittrick. Get me everyone. Now." The colonel hesitated. "Sir, the phone lines. Are they out?" "Yes, sir. We're isolated." Model's face went hard. In seconds he had assessed the situation and understood its terrible implications. Airborne forces landing near his headquarters. Communications cut. This wasn't a bombing raid. This wasn't random harassment. This was an assault. A deliberate, coordinated assault aimed at capturing or killing him. "Evacuate," Model ordered. "Immediately. Gather all essential documents. We leave in 5 minutes." His staff exploded into motion. Officers ran for their rooms. NCOs began shouting orders. Outside vehicles roared to life. Model walked quickly to the window and looked up. The sky was full of aircraft. Not flying overhead, coming down. Gliders and parachutes, hundreds of them settling toward the earth like falling leaves. "Mein Gott," Krebs whispered beside him. "What is this?" 21 miles away, Colonel General Kurt Student was asking himself the same question. He stood on his balcony at Vought, watching the impossible unfold before his eyes. The sky was full of gliders. Not a few gliders. Not a company, or even a battalion of gliders. The entire sky from horizon to horizon was filled with gliders and their tow planes. A vast aerial fleet that seemed to stretch forever in every direction. Student had been a soldier for 40 years. He had pioneered German airborne operations. He had planned and executed the daring assault on Crete, the largest airborne operation in Wehrmacht history. He understood airborne warfare better than almost anyone alive. He had never seen anything like this. "Herr General," Major Reinhard burst onto the balcony. "We must do something." But Student couldn't move. He stood transfixed, watching gliders cut loose from their tugs and begin their descent. Some were angling toward Eindhoven to the south. Others seemed to be heading for Nijmegen. Still more were passing overhead, bound for destinations farther north. "Oh," student said softly, "if ever id had such means at my disposal." His voice was filled with longing. Just once to have this many planes. "Sir." Student shook himself, forcing his mind back to the immediate crisis. This was no time for professional jealousy. His training took over his tactical instincts, firing up like a well-oiled machine. The bridges. There, after the bridges. It was the only explanation that made sense. A ground offensive from the south combined with airborne forces seizing the bridges at Eindhoven, Grave, Nijmegen, maybe even Arnhem, securing a corridor straight through Holland to the Rhine. It was audacious. It was brilliant. It was exactly what he would have done with such resources. "Get me model," student ordered. "Use runners if you have to. We need to coordinate." "Sir, the phone lines are dead." Of course they were. The airborne forces would have cut communications as a first priority. Student had written the doctrine himself. Then send motorcycle couriers. Alert all bridge commanders. They are to hold their positions at all costs. The bridges must not fall intact. Reinhardt saluted and ran from the room. Student remained on the balcony watching the sky trains pass overhead. Even now part of him couldn't help but admire the operation's scale and ambition. The Allies had learned well from Crete. They had taken his innovations and improved upon them, expanded them, turned them into something even he hadn't imagined possible. And now those innovations were being used against the Reich. The irony was almost painful. At Field Marshal von Rundstedt's headquarters in Koblenz, the duty officer burst into the command center with a report so extraordinary that he initially didn't believe it himself. "Sir, massive airborne landings reported across Holland. Multiple divisions. Thousands of aircraft. Von Rundstedt, Germany's most senior commander, the aristocratic Prussian officer who had led armies for decades, set down his coffee cup very carefully. Repeat that. Airborne assault, sir. American forces near Eindhoven and Nijmegen. British forces at Arnhem. Initial reports indicate division-level strength." Von Rundstedt stood and walked to the map table. His staff gathered around him, uncertain, waiting for his response. For a long moment, the field marshal said nothing. He simply stared at the map of Holland, his mind racing through implications and possibilities. Montgomery. This had to be Montgomery's operation. But that made no sense. Montgomery was cautious, methodical, predictable. Montgomery husbanded his forces and advanced only when overwhelming superiority was assured. Montgomery didn't take risks like this. Except, apparently he did. "Gentlemen," von Rundstedt said quietly, "I believe we have underestimated our opponent." The admission hung in the air. Von Rundstedt had always considered Montgomery overly cautious, habit-ridden, and systematic. A plodding general who won through material superiority rather than tactical brilliance. But this was neither cautious nor habit-ridden. This was bold to the point of recklessness. An airborne carpet 64 miles deep landed in daylight, aimed at seizing every bridge between the British Second Army and the Rhine. If it worked, the war could be over by Christmas. The Allies would have a bridgehead over the Rhine. The Ruhr would be isolated. Germany's industrial heartland would be cut off. "Where are our reserves?" von Rundstedt asked. His operations officer consulted a map. "Committed against Patton in the south, sir. You ordered all available armor to reinforce the Saar sector." Von Rundstedt closed his eyes briefly. He had made the right tactical decision based on available intelligence. Patton's Third Army had been the obvious threat. Aggressive, mobile, dangerous. Stopping Patton had been the logical priority. But logic didn't account for audacity. And Montgomery, cautious, systematic Montgomery, had just done something audacious. "Contact student," von Rundstedt ordered. "And Model. And Bittrick. Use any means necessary. We need to know exactly what we're facing." Reports were flooding in now, each more alarming than the last. American paratroopers near Eindhoven. More Americans at Grave and Nijmegen. British forces landing west of Arnhem. Gliders by the hundreds. Transport aircraft by the thousands. Fighter escorts sweeping the skies. And everywhere, the same story: German forces were surprised, outnumbered, and fighting desperately just to slow the assault. In Berlin, confusion reigned, even worse than at forward headquarters. Reports of airborne landings came from Holland, but also from contradictory locations. Some intelligence claimed paratroopers near Utrecht. Another report, later proven completely false, insisted that airborne forces had even landed in Warsaw, Poland. The fog of war had become a blizzard. But at the tactical level, in the fields and forests of Holland where gliders were actually landing, there was no confusion. Only shock. 1:00 p.m. Landing Zone S, west of Arnhem. The first British gliders cut loose from their tugs at 1,500 feet and began their final approach. From the ground, German soldiers of various security detachments watched in disbelief as the sky filled with descending aircraft. The gliders came in at steep angles, flaps fully extended, bleeding off speed for landing. "What are those?" a young Wehrmacht private asked his sergeant. The sergeant had no answer. Had seen Allied bombers before. Everyone had. Had even seen parachutes on rare occasions when damaged aircraft crews bailed out. But this was different. These were aircraft without engines, coming down deliberately, intentionally, by the dozens. Then the first Horsa touched down. It hit the heath at nearly 100 miles per hour, bounced twice, and skidded across the grass in a cloud of dirt and torn vegetation. The glider's nose dug into soft earth. The tail lifted, threatening to flip the entire aircraft. Then it slammed back down and the glider slid to a stop. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the tail section, the entire rear third of the glider, was unbolted from the inside. It swung open like a giant door. Soldiers poured out, weapons ready, moving with the precision of veteran troops. The sergeant finally found his voice. "Alarm! Alarm! Sound the alarm!" But more gliders were already landing. One came down so fast it cartwheeled when it hit the ground, shedding pieces as it tumbled. Another overshot its zone and crashed into trees at the edge of the field, its wooden frame splintering on impact. A third executed a perfect landing, rolled to a stop, and began disgorging troops before its skids had even stopped moving. Within minutes, the heath was covered with gliders, some intact, others wrecked, all of them depositing their human and mechanical cargo onto Dutch soil. Staff Sergeant Gordon Jenks was piloting a massive Hamilcar when he saw the glider ahead of him nose into the soft ground and flip completely over. The huge aircraft landed upside down, its tail pointing at the sky. Jenks immediately realized the problem: the landing zone was softer than anticipated. The soil couldn't support the weight of the heavy gliders at landing speeds. Noses were digging in, causing crashes. He had seconds to make a decision. "Diving," he shouted to his co-pilot. Jenks pushed the control yoke forward, putting the Hamilcar into a steep descent. The glider accelerated, trading altitude for airspeed. They flashed over the first field at 120 miles per hour. Too fast to land safely, but fast enough to maintain control. The fence at the far end of the zone rushed toward them. "Hold on." The Hamilcar skimmed over the fence with inches to spare, Jenks holding the nose up through sheer willpower and desperation. They cleared the obstacle and immediately he pulled back on the yoke, bleeding off speed, settling toward the ground in the field beyond. The Hamilcar touched down as lightly as a feather, Jenks would recall later. The massive glider rolled to a stop without incident. Behind him, the crew was already unbolting the nose section to drive out the light tank secured in the cargo bay. Not everyone was so fortunate. Lieutenant Michael Dauncey had just landed his Horsa, carrying a jeep trailer and 6 gunners, when he saw another Hamilcar coming in too hot. The 8-ton glider hit the soft ground and its nose immediately dug in. The aircraft's momentum drove it deeper. The tail rose up, and then the entire Hamilcar flipped over onto its back. Dauncey ran toward the wreck but stopped when he got close enough to assess the damage. "It's useless to try to dig them out," he said to the men beside him. "A horse is flat on top, but a Hamilcar's got a hump where the pilots sit. They're finished." The Hamilcar's crew, 2 pilots, were indeed dead, crushed when the cockpit collapsed. But the tragedy didn't slow the assault. More gliders kept coming, one after another, filling the sky like a flock of enormous wooden birds. Captain Anthony Jejewski was copiloting a Waco when their tug released them late. Too late. He watched with horror as they sailed past the landing zone, still at altitude, heading east. "We're going toward Germany," he shouted. "We're heading straight for the border." The pilot executed a sharp 180-degree turn, bleeding off altitude rapidly. Now they were too low, with not enough airspeed to reach the designated zone. The pilot scanned the ground desperately, looking for any place to land. "There," Jejewski pointed to a field. They came in fast and hard. As they descended, Jejewski saw a haystack directly in their path. The glider's left wing clipped it, shearing off completely. The right wing hit a fence and also tore away. Now they were essentially a falling fuselage, plowing nose first into Dutch soil. The impact drove earth up to Jejewski's knees. For a terrifying moment he couldn't tell if his legs were still attached to his body. Then pain registered, which meant nerve function, which meant he was intact. Out. Everyone out. They heard the distinctive crack of an 88mm gun firing. Somewhere nearby, German artillery was already ranging in on the landing zones. In Nothing Flat, Jejewski recalled, "We had the jeep out and were racing back toward our own area. Not everyone made it back." Captain John Connolly's pilot was killed during the approach, struck by a stray bullet or shrapnel through the thin glider skin. Connolly, who had never flown a glider before, suddenly found himself at the controls of a descending aircraft with no engine and limited understanding of the control surfaces. Somehow, through desperation and luck, he managed to land the Waco. Unfortunately, he landed it just inside the German border, 6 to 7 miles east of the intended zone, near the town of Weiler. Connolly and 1 other man escaped the glider before German troops arrived. They spent the rest of the day hiding in drainage ditches and farm buildings, finally making their way back to Allied lines by the morning of September 18th. The rest of Connolly's passengers were captured. But despite the crashes, the casualties, and the chaos, the landing was succeeding. Of the 320 gliders carrying Brigadier Pips Hicks' 1st Air Landing Brigade 295 reached their landing zones. More than 90% success rate, unprecedented for an operation of this scale. And 30 minutes later, the paratroopers followed. At 1:30 p.m., the C-47s carrying Brigadier Gerald Lathbury's 1st Parachute Brigade roared over the drop zones at 1,500 feet. The doors opened. The green light flashed. And 1,869 British paratroopers jumped into Holland. The sky blossomed with parachutes. White canopies against the blue September sky, drifting down like dandelion seeds on the wind. Lieutenant Pat Glover jumped with Myrtle, the parachute secured in her canvas bag, on his shoulder. At 300 feet, he unzipped the bag and released the chicken. Myrtle tumbled out, squawking indignantly, her small wings fluttering. For a moment she plummeted. Then her instincts kicked in, and she spread her wings wide, catching air, slowing her descent. Glover landed in a field. 30 seconds later, Myrtle landed beside him, ruffled but unharmed. "Good girl," Glover said, scooping up the chicken. "Welcome to Holland." Across the drop zone, similar scenes played out. Men landing in fields and forests, on roads and farmyards. Some landed perfectly. Others hit hard, spraining ankles or breaking bones. A few landed in trees and had to cut themselves down. But they were down. They were in Holland. And they were behind German lines. 15 miles south, the American 82nd Airborne was experiencing its own dramatic landing. General James M. Gavin, commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, stood in the door of his C-47, and watched German anti-aircraft fire blossom around the formation. Black puffs of smoke appeared ahead, flak bursts from 88mm guns. A C-47 in the formation ahead took a direct hit. Its right wing sheared off. The plane went into a flat spin, trailing smoke and debris, and disappeared behind the tree line. Gavin's face remained impassive. Had seen men die before. Had lost friends in Sicily and Italy and Normandy. Death was the price of airborne operations. The green light flashed. Let's go. Gavin stepped out into space. The wind caught him, spinning him slightly. His parachute deployed with a sharp jerk. Then he was floating, descending toward the Dutch countryside, his entire division following him out of the sky. The 82nd's objectives were crucial. Capture the bridge over the Maas River at Grave, take the Maas-Waal Canal bridges, and, most critically, seize the massive road bridge over the Waal River at Nijmegen. Without these bridges, the British ground forces couldn't advance north to link up with the airborne forces at Arnhem. The plan depended on speed and surprise. Get to the bridges before the Germans could demolish them. Gavin landed in a field near Oosterbeek, quickly shrugged off his parachute harness, and assembled his command group. Around him, paratroopers were landing by the hundreds, some gracefully, others less so. Private Melvin Essenci hit the ground hard, rolled, and came up with his rifle ready. For a moment he simply stood there looking around. The drop had been so smooth, so uneventful, that it felt anticlimactic. Then machine gun fire erupted from a tree line 200 yards away. Dirt kicked up near Essenci's feet. Contact. Contact front. And just like that, the battle began. The Americans moved with practiced efficiency. Squads formed up, located their objectives, and began moving. Officers consulted maps and compasses. Radiomen tried to establish communications. With mixed success. The SCR-300 radios had a notorious reputation for unreliability, and many units would spend the next hours operating in near isolation. But the mission was clear: get to the bridges. At 2:00 p.m., just 15 minutes after the main paratrooper drops, the gliders carrying the 82nd's artillery began arriving. These weren't supply gliders. They were weapon platforms. The 376th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion had trained for months for this moment. Each of their 12 75mm howitzers had been broken down into 7 pieces for air transport. The guns, the ammunition, the crews, all coming in by glider. Lieutenant Colonel Wilbur Griffith commanded the battalion. Had broken his ankle on the jump, but refused to be evacuated. His men found a Dutch wheelbarrow and used it to transport their colonel around the landing zone as he barked orders and coordinated the assembly. Within 1 hour, 60 minutes, 10 of the 12 howitzers were assembled and firing in support of the ground troops. It was the most successful rapid artillery deployment in airborne history. Guns in position, sir, and ready to fire on call, Griffith reported to General Gavin, still sitting in his wheelbarrow. Gavin, who rarely showed emotion, actually smiled. Outstanding, Colonel. Carry on. But not all the 82nd's glider landings were successful. 50 gliders launched from England. 46 reached Holland. Of those, 38 landed in or near the designated zones. The others came down miles away, some in Germany itself. One glider carrying critical radio equipment crash-landed in the Reichswald forest, just over the German border. The equipment was destroyed. The crew was captured. Another, co-piloted by Sergeant Roy Hatch, approached the landing zone through a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire. Hatch watched tracers arc up toward them, bright dots of light, rising in graceful curves, seeming to float before they flashed past. One burst caught their tug. The C-47 shuddered, smoke pouring from its starboard engine. The pilot released the tow rope immediately. Hatch's glider was suddenly free-flying, still at 800 feet, but rapidly descending. "Where do we put down?" the pilot Waldrop shouted. "Anywhere that's not on fire." They spotted a field, small, bordered by a canal, but it would have to do. Waldrop aimed for it, extending flaps, bleeding off speed. "Landing chute," Hatch pulled the lever that deployed the drag parachute from the glider's tail. The chute blossomed, yanking them backwards, slowing their descent dramatically. The canal rushed toward them. "We're not going to make it," Waldrop said, his voice eerily calm. "We're going to make it." The Waco skimmed over the canal, literally over it, the glider's belly clearing the water by inches. The nose hit the far bank. The glider's floor tore out. They plowed through dirt and grass, the world a chaos of noise and violence, until finally, mercifully, they stopped. Waldrop jumped out immediately, Tommy gun at the ready, taking a defensive position. Hatch pulled the lever to open the glider's nose. The Jeep's engine was already running. Within 60 seconds, all 5 occupants were loaded and racing toward the rally point. That, Hatch said, was closer than I care to repeat. By 300 reacher vuo from Mole 0 way. Mod trow. Falling night. Persix x 0y. My first 2 makes. My first is non. What? Mot. Mot. I. Mot. My. Mot. Sex. 500. In 3 hours, 3.5 divisions, more than 20,000 soldiers, had landed behind German lines in broad daylight, and the Germans who had initially dismissed the gliders as routine or even toys were beginning to understand the magnitude of the disaster unfolding around them. SS Sturmbannführer Sepp Krafft was the first German commander to respond effectively. From his bivouac area near Wolfheze, Krafft had watched the gliders come down with the same shock as everyone else. But unlike most German officers that afternoon, Krafft didn't spend precious minutes trying to understand what was happening, or waiting for orders from higher headquarters. He acted. "Battalion, form up. We move to block the roads to Arnhem." His SS Panzer Grenadier Training Battalion was under strength, barely 300 effective troops, and in the middle of reorganization. Many of his men were green recruits. He had limited heavy weapons. His communications with higher headquarters were cut. None of that mattered. Krafft understood with perfect clarity that British airborne forces had just landed west of Arnhem and would be moving toward the city, specifically toward the bridge over the Rhine. If they reached it before German forces could organize a defense, the bridge would fall intact. And if the bridge fell, Arnhem fell. And if Arnhem fell, the entire German defensive line in Holland was outflanked. Move. Move. Double time. Krafft's men grabbed their weapons and ran. Within 30 minutes, the battalion had positioned itself across the main roads leading from the British landing zones toward Arnhem. They set up machine gun positions, deployed their few mortars, and prepared hasty defensive positions. It wasn't much, but it was something. And in the chaos of that afternoon, something was better than nothing. 3 miles away, Colonel John Frost was leading the 2nd Parachute Battalion toward Arnhem at a fast march. Frost was a veteran of every major British airborne operation: North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy. He was professional, aggressive, and utterly fearless. His mission was simple: reach the road bridge over the Rhine at Arnhem and hold it until relieved by ground forces advancing from the south. Simple in concept, difficult in execution. Frost's battalion moved through the outskirts of Arnhem, encountering only scattered resistance. German troops they did encounter seemed confused, disorganized, unprepared. Many surrendered without a fight. This is too easy, Frost thought. Something's wrong. He was right. What Frost didn't know, what British intelligence had failed to identify, was that 2 SS Panzer divisions were refitting in the Arnhem area. The 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen and the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg, battle-hardened units from Normandy. Professional soldiers who knew how to fight. And they were beginning to organize. At the Henderloo Barracks, Lieutenant Colonel Walter Harzer's planned ceremony had been interrupted by the sound of aircraft engines. Harzer, commander of the 9th SS Panzer Division, had rushed outside to see gliders descending across the horizon. For a moment, Head simply stood there, champagne glass in hand, staring. Then his training kicked in. Cancel the ceremony. All units to battle stations. Now, the 9th SS Panzer Division exploded into motion. Men ran to their vehicles. Tanks, what few were operational, fired up their engines. Machine gun crews grabbed their weapons. Within minutes, the entire division was mobilizing. Captain Paul Graebner, the reconnaissance battalion commander who was supposed to receive the Knight's Cross that afternoon, led his men toward Arnhem without waiting for formal orders. His unit, 600 veteran soldiers in armored cars and half-tracks, raced toward the city. They would reach the bridge just hours after Frast's paratroopers. At 2 SS Panzer Corps headquarters in Doetin Chem, Lieutenant General Wilhelm Bittrich was coordinating the response of both panzer divisions. Bittrich was one of Germany's finest armor commanders, a pragmatic, aggressive leader who understood modern warfare. Head fought in France, Russia, and Normandy. Had seen what Allied air power could do. He had no illusions about German chances in a prolonged defensive battle. But he also understood that the British airborne forces, however impressive their arrival, were lightly armed. They had no tanks, limited artillery, and were completely dependent on resupply from the air. If he could isolate them before the ground forces linked up, the airborne troops would be vulnerable. Harzer's 9th SS will block the British at Arnhem, Bittrich ordered. Harmel's 10th SS will move south to hold Nijmegen. We split them. We isolate them. We destroy them, piece by piece. It was a sound plan. And it might have worked, except for one problem: the Nijmegen bridges. September 17, 1944, 3:30 p.m. The bridge at Grave. Lieutenant John Thompson led his platoon of 82nd Airborne paratroopers toward the massive bridge spanning the Maas River. Intelligence had reported the bridge was wired for demolition, protected by German engineers with orders to destroy it at the first sign of attack. Thompson's orders were simple: take the bridge before they can blow it. The platoon moved fast, covering the last mile at a run. They could see the bridge now, a steel and concrete span rising above the Maas, the far end disappearing into German-held territory. Machine gun fire erupted from the far side. Bullets whined off pavement, kicked up dirt. A paratrooper behind Thompson grunted and went down. Suppressive fire. Keep moving. The Americans charged the bridge, firing from the hip, not bothering to aim, just putting rounds down range to keep the German defenders' heads down. Some paratroopers vaulted the bridge's guardrails and scrambled down to the supports beneath, working their way toward the German side using the bridge's steel structure as cover. Thompson led the main assault straight down the roadway, the most exposed approach but also the fastest. A German engineer appeared at the bridge's center, running toward a control box. He was going for the detonator. 3 Americans fired simultaneously. The engineer jerked, stumbled, and collapsed. Go! 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 They reached the far end of the bridge. German defenders, perhaps 20 men, fought briefly, and then scattered. Most ran toward nearby buildings. A few threw down their weapons and surrendered. Thompson stood in the middle of the bridge, breathing hard, hardly believing they'd made it. Cut the wires, he shouted. Find the demolition charges and disarm them. Engineers from the 82nd moved in, locating the explosives wired to the bridge's supports. Within 30 minutes, the charges were disconnected and the bridge was secure. The Grave Bridge, one of the 5 crucial spans in the Market Garden corridor, had been captured intact. But at Nijmegen the situation was different. The bridge at Nijmegen was the largest in Europe, a massive steel span over the Wall River, wide enough for tanks and heavy vehicles. Taking it was absolutely essential. Without it, British ground forces couldn't advance north to Arnhem. But Nijmegen was also the farthest objective for the 82nd Airborne, 11 miles from their drop zones. And General Gavin had made a command decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Gavin had chosen not to drop paratroopers directly on the bridge. The risk was too great. If German anti-aircraft defenses were heavier than expected, the transport planes would be slaughtered. Instead, Head dropped his men farther from the bridge and ordered them to advance on foot. It was a reasonable decision based on available intelligence. It was also wrong. By the time American forces reached the outskirts of Nijmegen, late on the afternoon of September 17th, German reinforcements had already arrived. Captain Paul Graebner's SS Reconnaissance Battalion had reached the bridge and established defensive positions. The bridge would not fall on the first day, or the second. It would take a desperate river assault, one of the most courageous actions of World War II, before the bridge would finally be taken. But that was still days away. At his headquarters near Veitkoorden, to 25,000 to 25,000 men. The drops had been precise, coordinated, clearly aimed at specific objectives. The bridges. There, taking the bridges. Student had spent hours trying to contact his bridge commanders. Some hadn't responded. Their communications cut, their positions overrun. Others reported desperate fighting. A few had managed to blow their bridges, but those were minor spans over canals. The major bridges, the ones that really mattered, were either already captured or still being fought over, and ground forces were moving north from Belgium. British tanks advancing up a single highway, pushing toward the Airborne corridor to link up with the paratroopers. Student understood with professional certainty what was happening. The Allies were creating a 64-mile corridor from the Belgian border to Arnhem, a spear aimed straight at the heart of Germany. If it succeeded, the war was over. Get me every available unit, student ordered. Paratroop training battalions, security forces, depot guards. I don't care. Anyone who can hold a rifle. We have to slow them down. Slow them down, sir? We can't stop them. Not yet. We don't have the strength, but we can slow them. Make them fight for every bridge, every crossroad, every kilometer. Buy time for reinforcements to arrive. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only plan he had. Colonel John Frost reached the road bridge at Arnhem just before nightfall on September 17th. His 2nd Parachute Battalion, roughly 700 men, had fought their way through 8 miles of Dutch countryside, through the outskirts of Arnhem, past confused German security forces and increasingly organized resistance. They'd taken casualties. They'd lost contact with the rest of their division. Their radios weren't working properly. But they'd reached their objective. Frost stood at the northern end of the Great Bridge, looking south across the Rhine. The bridge was intact, undefended on this side. His men quickly moved into defensive positions in the buildings surrounding the northern approach. We hold this bridge, Frost told his battalion, no matter what. We hold until relieved. This, my natural speaking voice. 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 Unique voices. My natural speaking voice. You take sing helfis. Grading still. Wessel. My natural speaking voice. My natural speaking voice. My natural speaking voice. Porting. My natural speaking voice. 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 My natural speak. And the ground forces, the British 30th Corps that was supposed to advance 64 miles in 48 hours, were stuck. German resistance along the single highway was fiercer than expected. The terrain limited them to a one-tank front advance. Every destroyed vehicle blocked the entire column. Lieutenant General Frederick Browning, overall commander of the airborne operation, had worried about this from the beginning. At the final planning conference, looking at the map, head pointed to the Arnhem Bridge and asked Field Marshal Montgomery, "How long will it take the armor to reach us?" 2 days, Montgomery had replied confidently. Browning had studied the map, calculating distances, assessing German capabilities, weighing risks. "We can hold it for 4, head said. Then added quietly, "But sir, I think we might be going a bridge too far." He was right. September 20, 1944. Nijmegen. 3 days into the operation, the massive bridge at Nijmegen still hadn't fallen. German forces held the southern approach in strength. Direct assault had failed. Artillery bombardment was ineffective. Time was running out. Every hour of delay gave the Germans more time to reinforce Arnhem and isolate the British paratroopers there. Major Julian Cook, commanding the 3rd Battalion 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, was given an impossible order: cross the Wall River in broad daylight under fire and take the bridge from the north. The plan was insane. The river was 400 yards wide, with a current of 10 miles per hour. Cook's men would cross in canvas assault boats, 26 flimsy craft, each capable of carrying 13 men. They would paddle across under observation from German machine gun positions that dominated both banks. It would be a slaughter, but it was the only option left. At 300 Voorhead, at 300 wide, with a current of 10 miles per hour, machine guns, mortars, artillery, the river erupted in geysers of white water. Bullets churned the surface into foam. Boats disintegrated, spilling men into the fast-moving current. Private First Class Joe Atkins was in the 3rd wave. He watched the first boats get torn apart, watched men disappear into the river, watched the water turn red. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to find cover, to do anything except paddle toward that hell on the far shore. But he paddled. They all paddled. Some boats made it across, others capsized. Men drowned, weighed down by equipment. The wounded slipped beneath the surface and didn't come up. But enough boats, just barely enough, reached the far side. Cook's men stormed ashore, soaked, exhausted, and furious. They'd just crossed 400 yards of death. Nothing was going to stop them now. They charged the German positions with bayonets fixed and weapons firing. The defenders, stunned by the sheer audacity of the assault, broke and ran. By nightfall, the northern end of the Nijmegen Bridge was in American hands. It was one of the most courageous actions of the war. Major Cook would receive the Distinguished Service Cross. Multiple soldiers would receive Silver Stars and Bronze Stars. But the bridge had been taken too late to save the British at Arnhem. September 25, 1944. Arnhem. Colonel John Frost was a prisoner. His ammunition exhausted, his men wounded, his position finally overrun by German armor. Frost had been captured on September 21st. The rest of his battalion, what remained of it, had been forced to surrender. They had held the Arnhem Bridge for 4 days. 4 days against overwhelming odds, waiting for relief that never came. Now the entire British 1st Airborne Division was fighting for survival, trapped in a shrinking perimeter west of Arnhem, surrounded by SS Panzer units. The Poles who had been supposed to reinforce them had been devastated by weather and anti-aircraft fire. Their glider forces had been turned back or destroyed. Supply drops were falling into German hands. Radio communications had failed. The weather was terrible, grounding aircraft, and the British ground forces were still stuck miles away, unable to break through. On the night of September 25 to 26, the survivors of the British 1st Airborne, fewer than 500 men out of the original 10,000, were evacuated across the Rhine under cover of darkness. Operation Market Garden had failed. The bridge too far had been Arnhem, and that failure meant the war would not end in 1944. The numbers told the story. The largest airborne operation in history, Vivi 747-700 aircraft, 500 gliders, 34, Vivi 600 troops, delivered by air over 3 days. An unprecedented achievement in military logistics and coordination. Casualties: 17,000 Allied soldiers killed, wounded, captured or missing. The British 1st Airborne Division effectively destroyed. 8,000 British soldiers killed or captured at Arnhem alone. Entire battalions wiped out. German casualties: approximately 8,000 killed or wounded, substantial but not crippling. And Germany, fighting a defensive war, could afford to trade casualties better than the Allies could afford to attack. The bridges: most of the southern bridges had been taken. Eindhoven Grave, the wall at Nijmegen. But without the Arnhem Bridge, the corridor led nowhere. The operation's strategic objective, establishing a bridgehead across the Rhine, had failed. The war would continue for another 8 months. The Allied advance would stall. The Germans would launch their Ardennes offensive in December, the Battle of the Bulge. Thousands more would die before Germany finally surrendered in May 1945. But Market Garden had changed something fundamental. It had proven that large-scale airborne operations were viable. That gliders, those toy aircraft that Germans had initially mocked, could deliver entire divisions behind enemy lines. That airborne forces, properly supported and employed, could seize and hold strategic objectives. The doctrine would be refined, the tactics improved, the equipment enhanced, and in future operations, in the Rhine crossings of 1945, in Korea, in countless later conflicts, airborne forces would play crucial roles. The age of vertical envelopment, of dropping armies from the sky, had arrived, and it was here to stay. For the German commanders who had initially dismissed the gliders as routine, or even mocked them as toys, the lesson was brutal and undeniable. SS Sturmbannführer Sepp Kraft, whose quick response had helped slow the British advance on Arnhem, would later write, "The scale of the operation was beyond anything we had imagined. When those gliders began landing, hundreds of them carrying tanks and artillery and thousands of troops, we understood that we were facing something entirely new." Colonel General Kurt Student, who had watched the Armada pass overhead with a mixture of terror and admiration, never forgot the sight. In post-war interviews he would say, "It was the most impressive airborne operation I ever witnessed. If I had possessed such resources, even once, the course of the war might have been different." The Allies had taken everything we pioneered and perfected it beyond our wildest imagination. Field Marshal von Rundstedt admitted after the war that he had been astonished by the operation's boldness. I had always considered Montgomery overly cautious. The airborne assault proved I had underestimated him. It was a brilliant plan, audacious, imaginative, and nearly successful. That it failed was due more to luck and logistics than to any fundamental flaw in conception. But perhaps the most telling assessment came from Lieutenant General Wilhelm Bittrich, the 2 SS Panzer Corps commander, whose forces had ultimately defeated the British at Arnhem. When I first saw those gliders coming down, Bittrich said in a 1946 interview, I thought, "This is impossible. This cannot be happening." Wooden aircraft, no engines, landing in broad daylight, carrying entire battalions with their equipment. It defied all conventional military thinking. He paused, choosing his words carefully. We mocked them at first. Some of my men called them British kites or toy aircraft. We thought the Allies had gone mad, but within hours we understood the genius of it. Those fragile wooden gliders had delivered more combat power more rapidly over greater distance than any conventional assault could have achieved. They had dropped an entire army behind our lines before we even understood what was happening. Bittrich leaned forward, his expression grave. We won the Battle of Arnhem. But we learned to fear those gliders. We learned never again to underestimate Allied air power. And we learned that the war we thought we understood, had changed into something we could not ultimately win. The glider pilots of Operation Market Garden suffered the highest casualty rates of any unit in the operation. 54 glider pilots were killed or listed as missing on September 17 alone. More would die in subsequent days. These men flew aircraft with no armor protection, no engines to escape danger, no second chances if something went wrong. They landed in combat zones under fire with minimal control over their final approach. And yet they volunteered for the duty. Staff Sergeant Victor Miller, who successfully landed his Hamilcar under intense anti-aircraft fire, would later be asked why he did it. Someone had to, he said simply. The infantry needed those supplies, the artillery pieces, the ammunition. Without us, the operation fails before it begins. So we flew. Flight Lieutenant David Lord exemplified the courage of the transport pilots. On September 19, flying a Dakota supply drop mission over Arnhem, his aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire and burst into flames. Rather than break off and attempt a crash landing, Lord circled the drop zone twice, his aircraft literally burning around him, to successfully deliver his cargo of ammunition to the surrounded British paratroopers below. Lord's Dakota finally exploded at 500 feet. The only survivor was Flying Officer Henry King, blown clear of the wreckage. Lord was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. Sergeant Roy Hatch, who had nearly ditched in the Channel and then crash-landed near a canal, survived the war. In his memoirs written decades later, he tried to explain what it was like. People ask if we were brave, he wrote. We weren't. We were terrified. Every flight, every landing, every mission. We were scared to death. But we had a job to do. Those paratroopers depended on us. The mission depended on us. So we flew our wooden gliders, we landed in whatever field we could find, and we got the job done. He paused before adding, and we prayed. Dear God, how we prayed. On a quiet September day in 1944, German soldiers across Holland looked up and saw the sky filled with gliders. Their first reaction was dismissal, mockery even. Wooden aircraft, canvas and plywood. No engines, no armor, no apparent military value. Toys. But those toys carried the seeds of Germany's defeat. They carried the M3 Stuart light tank that would provide crucial fire support at Nijmegen. They carried the 75mm howitzers that would break up German counterattacks. They carried the jeeps and trailers loaded with ammunition that would sustain the fight. They carried the radios, the medical supplies, the bridging equipment. Everything an army needs to fight and win. Most importantly, they carried men. Thousands of professional soldiers, American paratroopers, British glider infantry, artillery crews, engineers, landing precisely where they needed to be, when they needed to be there in daylight in the largest airborne operation in history. The Germans had pioneered airborne warfare. They had shocked the world with their assault on Crete in 1941. They had written the doctrine, developed the tactics, proven the concept. But the Allies had perfected it. They had taken the German innovations and scaled them up, industrialized them, turned them into a weapon system that could deliver entire divisions across hundreds of miles with acceptable accuracy and losses. The gliders were the key. Parachutes could deliver men, but not heavy equipment. Transport planes could carry cargo, but couldn't land in combat zones. Only gliders could deliver complete organized military units, with all their equipment directly to the battlefield. It was an innovation that would influence military thinking for decades. The concept of vertical envelopment, of using aircraft to place forces behind enemy lines to seize key terrain before defenders could react, would become a fundamental element of modern warfare. In Korea and Vietnam, in every conflict since 1944, the descendants of those market garden gliders would appear in different forms: helicopters, transport aircraft conducting air-land operations, airborne rapid deployment forces. But it all began with those wooden gliders over Holland. The ones the Germans initially mocked. The ones they called toys. 3 days after the landings, a German soldier was captured near Nijmegen. During his interrogation, an American intelligence officer asked him what he thought when he first saw the gliders coming down. The German was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked up at his interrogator. "I thought we had already lost the war," he said quietly. "I thought, how can we fight a nation that can do this? That can fill the sky with aircraft, that can drop entire armies behind our lines, that can coordinate thousands of planes to arrive at the same minute in the same place?" He shook his head. "When I saw those gliders landing, hundreds of them all at once, I understood for the first time that Germany could not win. We might fight for months or years longer. We might kill thousands more of you. But we could not win. Because you had resources we could not match, imagination we could not counter, and courage we could not break." The intelligence officer made notes, then asked a follow-up question. "What did you call them? The gliders?" The German smiled, but without humor. "At first, we called them toys, wooden kites." We laughed. And later, the smile disappeared. "Later we called them death from above. We called them unstoppable. We called them the weapon that broke our army." He looked directly at the American officer. "You want to know what I call them now? I call them the reason you won the war." On the 80th anniversary of Operation Market Garden, a memorial service was held at the Arnhem Oosterbeek War Cemetery. Among those present were a handful of surviving veterans, men now in their 90s and hundreds, some in wheelchairs, some supported by family members. One of them was a former glider pilot. A reporter asked him what he remembered most about September 17, 1944. The old man was silent for a long time, staring at the rows of white headstones stretching into the distance. Each stone marked a soldier who had flown in those gliders, who had jumped from those transport planes, who had fought for those bridges. "I remember the sound," he finally said. "Thousands of engines. The sky full of aircraft. The most beautiful and terrible thing I ever saw. Do you think it was worth it?" The veteran looked at him sharply. "We proved it could be done," he said. "We proved that airborne operations on that scale were possible. We delivered 3 divisions behind enemy lines in daylight, and most of us survived. We seized 5 bridges. We held them against SS Panzer divisions. We did things that the Germans thought were impossible. He gestured toward the cemetery. These men, my friends, my brothers, they didn't die in failure. They died proving that the impossible was possible. They died showing the world that free nations, when threatened, could do extraordinary things. The old pilot stood straighter despite his age. Was it worth it? Ask the children who grew up free because we fought. Ask the generations who never knew Nazi occupation because we stopped it. Ask the world that was shaped by our victory. He saluted the rows of white stones. Yes, he said quietly. It was worth it.